Today's lesson is on decimal tenths. The decimal 0.2 is the same as 2/10, the fraction. They're both read as 2/10 because they both mean the same thing. They mean 2 out of 10. We can also look at decimals and fractions in a place value chart. You're used to seeing hundreds, tens, and ones with whole numbers. Decimals and fractions are basically showing us what happens after the whole numbers in a place value chart. So after the number 0. Over here you can see we have the decimals marked on the place value chart, and we've put in the number 0.2. We have 0 ones because we don't have any whole numbers, and we have 2/10, which is our decimal and our fraction. Decimals can be modeled in different ways. Here are two pictures, both modeling the fraction 2/10. In the first picture, we can see that 2/10 of the rings are blue. And in the second picture, we can see that 2/10 of the rectangle is shaded in. How would we write this as a decimal? Well, 2/10 is the same as saying 0.2. Here is another picture representing the same fraction. On this side, we see 2/10 of the pizza has green pepper on it. And over here, the circle has 2/10 shaded in blue. Again, the decimal for the number 2/10 or the fraction 2/10 would be 0.2. And now you can see that we've placed 0.2 into the place value chart. Remember, that means we have no whole numbers, we have 0 ones, and we have 2/10. A 1x10 rectangle is a good model to show how fractions and decimals are related. We can use this model to count by tenths until we get to 1, which would be 1 whole. So count with me as we go along. If we shade in the first square, we will have 1/10, which is also 0.1. Then we would have 2/10, or 0.2, 3/10, 0.3, 4/10, 0.4, 5/10, 0.5, 6/10, 0.6, 7/10, 0.7, 8/10, 0.8, 9/10, 0.9, and 10/10, which would be 1.0 or 1. This is essentially the same thing as saying the number 1. It is 1 whole. We have the entire rectangle now shaded in, so it's considered a whole number now. We should also know how decimal tenths compare to the benchmark numbers of 0, 1/2, and 1, because it will help us to understand a little better. So let's look at some decimal tenth examples and compare them and try to place them on the number line. So for instance, if I have the decimal 0.4, I know that the fraction would be 4/10. And if I look at my number line here, I know that 0.5 is halfway on the rectangle. So I know that's probably the same as 1/2. And 0.4 then would be right about here on the number line, just as you see above in the fraction rectangle. If we look at 0.9, it's closest to the whole number of 1. We see it here, so therefore it would be here when we place it on the number line. Lastly, we see 0.2. 0.2 seems to be closest to 0. And if we place it on the number line, that is where it would be seen. Lastly, let's look at some examples with just the fraction. We're going to write the decimals for each of these fractions. Remember, we're only working with decimal tenths. So if I have the fraction 7/10, I would write that as 0.7. If I have the fraction 3/10, I would write it as 0.3. If I have the fraction 5/10, I would write it as 0.5. And if I have the fraction 8/10, I would write it as 0.8. Hopefully this has given you a little bit better of an understanding of how fractions and decimals can be related and decimal tenths.